Good morning and welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'm Marty Flax, Director of the Human Rights Initiative and Khosravi Chair in Principled Internationalism. We're delighted to be hosting this morning's event with the Heinrich Böll Foundation on U.S. and European strategies to tackle human rights in global supply chains. We're also recording this morning's session for the next episode of the Human Rights Initiative's new podcast, Intersections, which you can find on our website or wherever you find your podcasts. Global supply chains have faced unprecedented disruptions over the past 2 years due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Concerns about national security, economic stability, technological superiority are driving governments to take a greater interest in mapping and regulating global supply chains. And while that will inevitably lead to some onshoring or so-called friendshoring of certain industries, it won't change the fundamentally interconnected global nature of supply chains for most products. Geographic diversity, manufacturing capability, and environmental sustainability are all critical and much discussed aspects of building reliable, resilient supply chains. So is respect for human rights. Projects that fail to engage local stakeholders face protests, delays, and even cancellations. Industries that rely on the exploitation of workers increasingly face import bans, reputational risk, and even legal liability, as we'll talk about today. Failing to respect worker rights also makes industries less productive. The report of President Biden's Supply Chain Task Force tellingly noted, decades of focusing on labor as a cost to be controlled and not an asset to be invested in have depressed real wages and driven down union density for workers while contributing to companies' challenges finding and keeping skilled talent. As governments build the next generation of sustainable supply chains, respect for human rights must be integrated into the business model. Here today to discuss how the U.S. and European Union are working to do just that is a fantastic lineup of speakers. We're going to begin today's event with a conversation between Sabine Muscat, Program Director for Technology and Digital Policy with the Heinrich Böll Foundation, and Michael Anthony, co-founder of Vertical 52, about Michael and his team's investigation into the use of child labor in mica mining in India. I'm then going to moderate a conversation with 4 amazing panelists who I will introduce in a few minutes about current U.S. and EU policies, where those policies are headed, and what to expect going forward. At the end of the session, we will open to questions from our virtual audience, so if you'd like to submit a question, please do so on our website at csis.org, and we will read that later in the program. Sabine, now over to you for our initial conversation.
Thanks, Marty, and welcome from the Heinrich Böll Foundation as well. We are the German Green Foundation. We are headquartered in Berlin, Germany, but we have more than 30 offices around the world. And as Marty already said, I run the program for technology and digital policy at our Washington, D.C. office. And at our DC office, we engage in transatlantic and global dialogue about strengthening human rights, democracy, and social justice. And being the Greens, of course, we also strive to preserve a livable planet. I really look forward to the panel in a bit, but before we discuss possible policy solutions to how to create sustainable and rights-respecting supply chains, we would like to kick off this event with the launch of a journalistic investigation that illustrates the complex task of protecting human rights in global supply chains. And this investigation was supported by the Heinrich Böll Foundation offices in Washington, D.C. and in Brussels, European Union. So what's highlighted in this investigation is the example of child labor in illegal mica mines in India. And mica, glimmer, is a critical material for the tech sector, but it's also used in cars and cosmetics and paints. The data journalist team of Vertical 52 used a mix of satellite data analysis, document research, and interviews on the ground to look into the state of child labor in India's illegal mica mines. And this investigation was published in English and in German by Die Zeit. You can find a report about the project on our website, us.boell.org. And also, of course, you can find it on site online in German or in English. So today, and I have now here with me one of the authors of this investigation, that's Michael Anthony. He's the co-founder of Vertical 52, but he's also the founder of Earth Analytics, that's a satellite data company based in Mumbai. Hi, Michael, and welcome.
Thank you. Hi, Sabine. Pleasure to be here.
So the problem of child labor in mica mining in India has been well documented by many organizations, including by the child rights organization Terre des Hommes, and we'll hear more from Barbara on the panel. Businesses, policymakers, and NGOs have all tried to address the problem of illegal mica mining over the past years. They've collaborated in the Responsible Mica Coalition, but did this work? Michael, what did your analysis find?
Yeah, so what we did, we used satellite data, and satellite data is actually extremely useful, particularly if you want to understand what's happening on the first mile of the commodity supply chain. And what I'll do is I'll share my screen so that I can take you through the investigation we did basically in 3 steps. It's just coming up full screen. We did this investigation, as you said, partly through a journalist who was on the ground, but on the other hand, also we did it from our desks at Vertical 52 in Berlin, 52 being also Berlin's latitude. So what we did, just very briefly on the technological angle, is we took satellite data. We wanted to understand, first of all, are mining operations active, and where is mica being mined? So we took data from the North American Space Agency's Landsat satellite. We took a scientifically proven algorithm that gives us a reflectance on where mica is. So where do you find the geological reflectance of mica on the ground? And you can see these little pinkish dots on my screen or on your screen overlaid on a Google map. And after having seen where mica is and also how it evolved, we turned to simply Google Earth. Google Earth has a wonderful wealth of high-resolution satellite data, mostly from Maxa, a US company. And I'll take you to some of those mines here in Bendro, which is the site that also the journalist has visited. And if you zoom to the mine, and we did this with several ones, you can very simply look back in time, 2013, for example, how has the mine been then, and then see over the years how you see that the mining area is actually increasing. And what you see here are very typical constellations of roads being built, ending in the forest, and then you see these little deforested areas where the mining operations are taking place. So that's essentially what we did, and we found that yes, illegal mines are on the rise, particularly over the last years, even during, or particularly during the pandemic.
Wow, that's interesting. Clearly, there's a lot going on in mines that shouldn't even exist after they were supposedly closed. What does this mean for importers, for companies importing mica? How can they be sure that the mica that they're buying on the world market does not come from one of those mines?
It's actually a bit tricky when you look into the data. So we did a public data investigation to understand where does these mica come from in the Indian context. Now, official Indian export statistics from 2020 show that 150,000 tons of mica are being exported. But if you look at the production statistics, you only find from the same year, you find that only 32,000 tons of mica are being mined in 2 states where mining is legal. Now, most of mica is being mined in a state where mining is illegal, so that doesn't show up in the Indian production statistics. But it's also difficult for the importers to know because they're being given a certificate from an export license from one of the legal states. So they don't actually necessarily know where mica is being mined for. So there's another transparency issue that is obviously there. Then it's being exported to a number of different countries. Some of it's going straight to those companies, for example, in Europe, that have chemical companies that have a pigment industry, so that mica is then being used in cosmetics, for example, or car paint, but it's also being exported very often to China, for example, where it's first used in a product, constructed in a product, and then forward exported or further exported to other consuming countries.
Yeah, that's quite a gap there, and it sounds like a lot of the mica that's leaving the country is not really accounted for. But then coming to the topic of our panel, how do you verify that there's a link between those the expansion of those illegal mines and child labor?
I mean, there's only obviously so much you can see from space, right? I mean, particularly when it comes to, the contextual information, you have to put boots on the ground. And of course, there are many NGOs who do that, Ted Isom's partner and others. But we actually sent a journalist who was part of our investigation team she was from the neighboring state. So she went up to...
Oops. Now we lost Michael.
To those mines, to the young mine. Are you sure? Just give me a thumbs up if you hear me back. I can hear you well. But I'll just continue because I can hear you well. So many women and children do work in the mines, and mining is also the key income source in poor districts in Jharkhand. So clearly, none of those miners would like to lose their jobs. So this is Nazneen, one of the micas that our journalist was speaking to, and for her, mining is a key income, and it was actually the go-to place, particularly during the years of the pandemic when the schools were closed.
Yep, there is Nazneen.
Over to you.
Yep, we can see her, and you were breaking up a bit, but I think we heard the gist of what you said about the research on the ground by the Indian journalist, by Anu. Yeah, so it seems that the combination of satellite data analysis, document research, like open source document research, and interviews are really an effective method for tracking what's going on in a supply chain. And I was wondering, Michael, what are other sectors where satellite data might be a useful tool for that?
Yeah, I think as I said, commodities. So first mile of a supply chain in commodities where spatial information is needed, where particular structures need to be investigated. So we have another investigation running in China, in the Xinjiang province, where obviously there are reports about forced labor, or the Uyghur minority being put into forced labor, particularly in cotton harvest. So what we're trying to do, and I think we managed it quite well, was to see which cotton fields are harvested by machines, as the official sort of the official Chinese line is that's mostly harvested by machines, and which is harvested by hands. Now, this obviously doesn't tell us whether there's forced labors in those hand-harvested fields, but it's still an important piece of the puzzle, an important mosaic piece to understand what is the condition and what is the potential involvement of forced labor in the cotton value chain. And again, this is something that satellite data can give us an important evidence, an important contextual, and this case, sort of spatial and even in-depth information. Yep,
that's fascinating, and especially with a view to the steps that the US has already taken towards banning imports from Xinjiang. And the EU is also discussing such steps. So with that, I think it's a perfect segue to turn over to Marty and to our panel. Thank you, Michael, for joining us today.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thanks, Sabina. What an interesting presentation and great context for the discussion that we're going to have with our panelists this morning, who I'm going to introduce now. First, let me introduce Heidi Hautala. Heidi is Vice President of the European Parliament and member for the Greens European Free Alliance. She is the former Minister for International Development and State Ownership Steering in Finland. She also serves on the Committee on International Trade, the Subcommittee on Human Rights, and as a substitute on the Committee on Legal Affairs. And in 2017, she established the European Parliament's Working Group on Responsible Business Conduct. We're so delighted to have you here with us. I will also introduce Thea Lee. She is Deputy Undersecretary for International Affairs in the Bureau of International Labor Affairs at the Department of Labor in the United States. She was previously President of the Economic Policy Institute and Deputy Chief of Staff, Policy Director, and Chief International Economist at the AFL-CIO. David McCain is the Acting Executive Director of the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable, a coalition of NGOs working on business and human rights issues. Prior to joining ARCAR, David led the Asia program at Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights and practiced civil rights law with the Service Members Legal Defense Network. And finally, Barbara Coopers is Public Affairs Manager for Terres Hommes, an international children's rights organization where she has been since 2012. Her work focuses on child rights issues at the national and international level, child labor and supply chains, compliance and sustainability, and environmental issues. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us today for what I look forward to a really interesting conversation. I want to start with MEP Hautala, and a question for you. As you hear this description of the challenges of child labor in mica mining in India, I want to use that as context for expectations that we set of companies. And I would love to hear from you what expectations you would lay out, what steps you would expect companies who might use mica in their supply chains, in their products, to take to ensure that there is not forced labor or child labor at the end of their supply chains or through their suppliers? And what would you expect to happen if companies fail to do so?
Thank you very much. I think it's extremely important and timely that we have this transatlantic discussion on supply chains and as we in Europe would say, due diligence. Because as you know, Europe has been quite, let's say, in the forefront in implementing the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, what we call the smart mix, which is a combination of not only voluntary, but also mandatory measures. And that's why the European Commission has now given this proposal for a directive, what we call CSDD, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And I would say that almost all stakeholders who are working on issues like forced labor and child labor, environmental damage due to our consumption, consider that this instrument would be the crucial one. Not the only one, but it's the crucial one that needs to be put in place. And we're sort of starting now to work on it in the European Parliament, but also among the 27 member states, so that we can, as co-legislators, we can then have a final outcome, hopefully this year already. Now, I think this investigation was extremely interesting. I also used by coincidence or not by coincidence, the MICA as an example of why we need the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And I think satellite pictures are a very important tool to prove developments which relate to spatial issues like land use. And I think there's other examples of this kind of traceability means. For instance, I've been in talks with the US Customs and Border Protection who implement the import ban on products produced with forced labor to the United States. And they have my understanding is that they have access to very sophisticated instruments which can trace by isotope analysis techniques, for instance, cotton, which is produced in Xinjiang, which has a strong suspicion of forced labor. So we need these technical means, but I think I would really overemphasize the need of legislation, and I look very much forward to a future discussion, for instance, in the Trade and Technology Council that we have now between the US and the EU on this type of issue, because we do see that there's a momentum in the United States. Joe Biden has been quite vocal on forced labor, and this corresponds extremely well with what we are busy with in the EU. So we need a level playing field, not only in the EU, but also globally, and that could be a great step forward if we put our, let's say, thinking together now.
Thank you for that. And maybe you can tell us a little more what's tipping the balance in the EU towards this legislation. You talked about the smart mix of initiatives, and we had many years, decades really, of pushing companies to take action voluntarily to trace their supply chains, to carry out due diligence. We went through a phase of mandatory transparency where we asked companies to disclose information, that the steps they were taking, for example, to combat forced labor in their supply chains. We're now moving to a phase, at least in the European Union, of required company action, as you said. What do you think is pushing the EU, or seems to be pushing the EU, over the edge on that particular issue? Is there one particular event or situation? Is it the accumulation of years of evidence? Why do you think we're at this place in 2022?
Well, in about 2018, I had a shocking discovery that the biggest chocolate companies, multinationals like Nestle, Mondelez, Mars, Wrigley, they were all saying that they cannot eradicate child labor and deforestation from their products. And that's a terrible pain, talking to their clients and, to consumers who require more and more ethically produced chocolate and cocoa. So Then I would say that the real mover has been the progressive companies that feel that they are obliged to fulfill these ethical requirements. And they have time and time again called for mandatory legislation. And then I have to say that Professor John Ruggie, the father of the UN Guiding Principles, was so excited about what was happening in the EU. Unfortunately, he died in September last year, which was a big loss, I would say. But he very much emphasized the EU's sort of leading role. So I would say progressive companies, civil society, I mean, loads and loads of labor organizations, human rights organizations, environmental groups. Like almost there's been a very important and let's say significant coming together of different stakeholders. And that's what we are sort of also doing in the European Parliament. In the US, it might have to be bipartisan. In the European Parliament, it has to be multi-partisan because we are from many parties. So very effective, I would say. And the progressive member states as well.
Absolutely. So I want to now turn to Deputy Undersecretary Lee. As the MEP alluded to, we're not quite there yet in the U.S. in terms of the idea of mandatory human rights due diligence, but the U.S. has taken a lot of steps in recent years to try and encourage companies to trace their supply chains, to carry out due diligence. We already referenced the enforcement of the Tariff Act ban on goods being imported that were made with forced labor. One of the things the Biden administration has committed to do is put together a national action plan on responsible business conduct and kind of lay out its vision for expectations of companies. What do you hope to see in that national action plan from a labor rights perspective?
Thank you so much, Marty, and what a pleasure it is to be here with all of you on this conversation. I think the National Action Plan is a really important first step. This is how we convey to businesses what we expect of them. But I think it's also important what Haiti was talking about, that we have to go beyond just laying out expectations, because we've had, honestly, several decades of, laying out expectations and committing and pledging and promising. And as Haiti said, there's, the number of children in child labor is growing, not shrinking. And the pandemic, I think, has exacerbated a lot of the kinds of challenges that we have. And so, I think that this conversation that we're having now about the requirements on companies for transparency in their supply chains is really important. And however we get there, whether it's through mandatory due diligence legislation, as Germany, the EU, France, the UK are looking at versions of that, or in the United States, we tend to do it more, as you said, with trade enforcement, which also is a form of mandatory due diligence in the sense that, for the Customs and Border Protection to say, if those goods are made with forced labor, they are not going to come into the United States of America. And the Congress has asked the Labor Department to do a better job tracing through the supply chain where goods are. So I think it's really, as Haiti says, it's a smart mix of measures where we are giving people the expectations, which is, I think, what the business plan is about, the National Action Responsible Business Plan, but also creating economic consequences for failure to comply, which is the threat of losing market access. Hopefully we never have to use that, because we can make the economic consequences significant enough that companies will find it profitable to do a better job. And, I honestly, for a couple of decades, I have been frustrated listening to companies tell me they can't possibly know what's in their supply chain. They can't possibly be held responsible, whether there's, environmental damage or heinous labor rights abuses. It's really not their problem, especially if it's several levels down. And yet, at the end of the day, they're ultimately responsible because they pay for it, they put their name on it. I hope they're doing the kinds of quality control that they need to do to ensure that the product that they're bringing to market is safe and is everything that it's advertised to be. But I think it's also a big part of that to say, and it's also not made with abusive child labor or forced labor, modern slavery. These things are just so reprehensible. And consumers, I think, have a right to not be complicit in purchasing those things, but also businesses and workers that are being responsible, that are doing the right thing, that are playing by the rules, should not be in competition with companies that are not playing by the rules. And governments that fail to enforce their laws. I think also need to understand that they may lose out on foreign investment, that they may lose out on market access. And so this is what I hope is a new era that we have here of more responsibility, transparency, integrity in supply chains, and the expectations of what we want from businesses have grown.
Thanks for that. Absolutely. And just to follow up on the framing that I think is really important, which is that the U.S. has focused on sort of the enforcement side of this picture. The EU due diligence directive in part is focused on the upstream prevention, and then obviously there are legal consequences for that failure. In the U.S., a lot of our tools right now are focused on imposing consequences like an import ban if companies don't take steps to prevent goods being made with forced labor. Does the U.S. have the enforcement tools that it needs to actually provide an adequate deterrent to companies? We haven't seen, for example, widespread use of, or really any use of, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, to prosecute companies for trafficking or forced labor in their supply chains. We have seen CBP pick up its enforcement of the Tariff Act prohibition, but often that's sort of turning goods around at the border and saying you have to send them somewhere else, rather than imposing a fine or seizure in many cases. Are there additional tools that you think we could use, or are there additional resources that the government could use to kind of step up enforcement of some of our existing prohibitions?
Well, that's a great question, Marty. And I think we have both new powerful tools and we have old tools that haven't been adequately used. So I think we do have a lot in our arsenal. We always could use some new ones, but the new tools, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that President Biden signed into law in December of 2021 is very powerful. And right now, the Labor Department is part of the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force in the United States, and we are, together with CBP and other agencies, putting together an enforcement strategy. This will go into effect this summer. So I think there is going to be, this is basically a rebuttable presumption that goods made in Xinjiang are made with forced labor unless a company can demonstrate the opposite. And this puts a real burden of proof on companies. And I think this is an extraordinary measure, but it is needed because there is no transparency in Xinjiang. The Chinese government simply does not allow the kind of audits and access that would be needed for even for a company that has production in Xinjiang to be able to say with confidence, there's no forced labor in my supply chain, even though my products are coming from Xinjiang. So that's a really important tool, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. As you said, Customs is using the withhold release orders, the Tariff Act of 1930, much more aggressively and consistently than in the past. We also have the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, which has the strongest labor rights provision of any trade agreement in the world. And those provisions are actually, we're working really productively with the Mexican government, the Mexican Labor Department to reform Mexican labor law, but also to work with Mexico and Canada to coordinate across national borders in our fighting against the imports of goods made with forced labor. So I think international coordination is also, as Haiti said, a really important piece that we can and should do more of. I was just in Berlin last week at the G7 supply chain conference, sustainable value chains. That was really, really interesting to hear what people are doing, but also to think about how we might share information, share resources, maybe coordinate enforcement actions with the EU, with Canada. And I think that could be very important. We also have, we have the generalized system of preferences, which is our beneficiary program for developing countries, a trade benefits program. The EU has their own version of it, and yet we sometimes take actions that are either in contradiction to each other or not supportive of each other, even though I think, the information that we have might lead us to some of the same conclusions in terms of a country that is not really in compliance with its international labor rights obligations. So those are some of the tools, but I think at the end, that the withhold release orders do concentrate the mind wonderfully. The threat that for a company of producing something and then finding out that it is stopped at the border is pretty scary, and I think it does have a demonstration effect for other companies. But what I hope is that we are in this era where we are doing international coordination, multilateral commitments through the G7, through the G20, through the ILO, through the OECD, that can send a very powerful message to governments and to business that we're serious here, that we want to be able to understand that consumers want to know, workers want to know, NGOs want to know, academics want to know what is in the supply chain at every level, and that companies ultimately do bear that responsibility.
Thank you. Yeah, that was quite a comprehensive overview of a really wide array of tools. And I want to bring in our two civil society panelists to get some of your reactions. David, I want to start with you. From the U.S. perspective, we just heard an incredible list of resources and tools available to help combat human rights abuses in supply chains. How do you see those being deployed in practice? Where do you see the real opportunities being leveraged? And do you still see gaps that you would like to see filled?
Yeah, thank you, Marty, and thanks to all the panelists. I'll just first note that when you're in civil society and in an advocacy space, it's wonderful to hear government officials already lay out everything you would like to say. That means that we're in a really excellent posture for making some real progress for civil society and those in government to work together to get some real changes done. I think the key for those of us in civil society that we've seen, Marty, you alluded to this a little bit in your opening remarks, is that we've moved from an era of mandatory transparency or voluntary measures to one of enforcement, to a recognition that it's not enough and there's not really a consumer-driven mechanism for this change that we need to see in supply chains for responsible and sustainable supply chains to take place. Consumers just don't have access to the information in many cases. There's many brands that aren't really public-facing brands that you can organize, boycotts of or reputational damage to. The MEP mentioned Nestle and Mars. Obviously, those are on your grocery store shelves and you can choose not to buy them. But there's many business-to-business products and other things that you can't really take a consumer-driven approach to. But what you can do is, as we've done in many cases, that what's happening in Europe with MHRDD or MHREDD, or some of the enforcement tools that we've built here in the United States and continue to build, is drive enforcement and make it so that companies find it find it worthwhile. The incentives are changed so that they undertake the due diligence, either because you're requiring the due diligence directly or because the enforcement requires that they stay on the right side of the enforcement line by performing their own due diligence. I think those are just two sides of the same circle. The enforcement's required. Anybody who's ever tried to enforce any rule knows that you need to have visibility into what's happening so you can know whether there's a violation, and then you need a tool to enforce a violation, enforce misbehavior in that violation, and that's ideally what we're seeking to build. I also think that some of the posture that we've seen, especially with respect to the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, with as Deputy Under Secretary Lee said, with a shifting burden, is going to be critical. So many goods are either produced or tied to practices that are covered by the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, especially when you think of the apparel industry and cotton or polysilica in some of these clean energy sector technologies. We obviously need clean energy. We obviously need to get that right, but we also, it's not a sustainable business model for those technologies to be produced through modern day slavery or Uyghur forced labor. And if we can't have access to the transparency and understanding how those goods are produced, then we need to take a real hard look at whether they belong in a U.S. marketplace. And I think by law they can't. There's two final pieces. One, and Deputy Undersecretary Lee also touched on this as well, the information sharing amongst friends who have similar interests is critical. Europe is looking at establishing, and will be establishing a similar piece of legislation akin to our Tariff Act. There's no reason that the U.S. should be undertaking investigations to block goods that isn't shared with the Europeans, so that they can also be taking similar action, vice versa. There's also no reason why all of the due diligence that's being required by Europe shouldn't also be undertaken by, U.S.-based companies who may or may not be covered by the European directive, but who, if they ever plan to gain access to a European market or they ever plan to not have their goods blocked by a tariff act enforcement action, an MHRD style piece of legislation and piece of guidance would be incredibly instructive, I would think, to making sure that they're taking the action that they need. And then the final thing I'll say is that, it's the investigation that we opened with, this conversation opened with, I think really demonstrates the complexity of getting to some of these supply chains where you have multiple layers and many, many steps between an illegally produced good that's the result of human rights abuses or labor rights violations or child labor, and a final polished product that looks gleaming on your, department store shelf. For many industries and for many companies, that that level of supply chain dispersal has been a feature and not a bug that they've sought to keep themselves at an arm's distance, and I think it's critical that be made to be a real vulnerability and a real exposure to liability, so that they can figure it out. MEP Hotala said it was an eye-opening moment for her when she heard from the cocoa companies that they cannot know and cannot produce their goods without the violations that are taking place. I've always been I've heard that many times from companies, and then I'm always struck when there's an E. coli outbreak in spinach. Not all spinach is pulled off the shelf. All of a sudden, producers of spinach are able to say, no, it's just these bags. We know down to the hectare where the production was and where it came from and where it moved through supply chains, because it's worth it for them to not pull every bag off the shelf. But despite that being an incredibly complicated supply chain where goods are mixed, they can do it. They always can do it. But for enforcement purposes, this report to me demonstrates I think should demonstrate to us all the complexity of getting to the bottom of these supply chains, but also that while it's critical for NGOs to play a role here, governments also need to play a role in funding and supporting and undertaking these investigations, because ultimately it's their enforcement. This is state-based enforcement, and NGOs can play a role in directing them to good leads, and we can have the connections to the people on the ground. But ultimately, the burden shouldn't fall on NGOs to produce high quality and actionable reports all by itself. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, David. Absolutely. And I want to pick up right where you left off, which is the role of governments. And I want to bring in Barbara. When you think about situations like the one we heard about in India with mica mining and with child labor in particular, there's also a component of local government regulation and local government action or inaction, right, to make sure that the conditions are not ripe for illegal mining or for child labor. What would you like to see the U.S., European Union, European governments do to help or encourage those governments to create or enforce more effective labor laws? I think that's an important piece. We've talked a lot about the company responsibility, and we'll come back to that, but I just want to pause a moment on the government role. What would you like to see the U.S. and European governments do in that regard?
Thank you for this question. I would love to add another aspect to the so-called smart mix, which is about being voluntary or not voluntary. It is about looking into the root causes. If it comes to child labor, we have root causes in society. It's poverty, it's discrimination, it's in India, it's the caste system, and so on and so on. And of course, we have to be very we have to look very closely into the situation of this discussion, because there is a danger of getting clean supply chains, but not ending child labor, but pushing children into informal businesses, into much worse labor, prostitution, and so on, if there is no alternative they have. So it's of utmost importance that there are alternatives to children, and of course this can be done by businesses. There are many examples and ideas to do this. But as well, there are other instruments that we have to use as well, and it's very, very important to use them, like the Sustainable Development Goals. If it comes to child labor, it's really, really important to support education for children, get all children into school, free, compulsory, quality education for really every child, even the poor ones, the discriminated against ones, the girls, the stateless children, the refugee children. And this is one of the most important tools to tackle and address child labor. So this has to be a part of this smart mix. I know it's a bit different level, but this is our core interest, to not to forget, give alternatives to children.
Absolutely, and that's a really important point. You've got to put the context of what is creating the supply of child labor and what is creating the demand of people to work in those conditions. It's really important context. We're getting quite a good number of questions from our audience, which is great. So I'm going to start to integrate some of those into our next questions. And maybe I'll just pick up right where you left off on this question of sort of how we support governments and even civil society groups to kind of combat those structural issues and empower groups that are trying to combat forced labor. And I want to come back to Thea Lee to talk a little bit about some of the work that the Department of Labor is doing around particularly capacity building, both of governments, but also importantly of civil society organizations, who are the ones, as David referenced, sort of doing a lot of these investigations and trying to change conditions on the ground, organizing workers to fight for their rights. Can you talk a little bit about some of that work?
Thank you so much for that question, Marty. And I'm very excited to talk about a new initiative that the Labor Department is spearheading called MPOWER, the Multilateral Partnership for Organizing Worker Empowerment and Rights, greatest acronym of all times. But it actually fits really well into what Barbara was just saying also, because we think all the time about the root causes. And I completely agree with Barbara. You can't just take a child out of a factory or even a field and expect to solve the problems. I mean, one of the key things is that you need to change the balance of bargaining power in a system. You need to build a strong democracy. You need to build organizations that can stand up for working people. So if the parents of children do not have decent jobs, then the kids are probably going to end up out there scrabbling with a pickaxe in the backyard, trying to earn a few bucks, because that's what we do to survive. And so it really does start with, good jobs, social protection, and MPOWER is all about strengthening worker voice and worker power, especially in places where workers don't have that. They don't have the right to organize, the freedom of association, the right to bargain collectively. And we see that as an essential part of democracy, but it is also about sort of beginning to change the power. Because what I see, I think the problem in some of this work is if you can spend decades and decades like giving people money or trying to solve problems or buying, tools to get people out of child labor. But if you can't give people the right to stand up for themselves and to advocate and so on, then it's not going to happen. So MPOWER is a U.S. government begun initiative, but we hope it will be much broader than that. The U.S. AID and the State Department and the Labor Department have pledged $124 million over 2 years to strengthen worker voice around the world. And now we're bringing in other governments. We've seen interest from Germany, from Sweden, from Canada, and and Mexico. We're talking to a lot of other governments. We've also talked to philanthropic organizations that have pledged another $100 million to support this work. So we're really excited. And part of what it is coordinating those efforts so that we can all, instead of stumbling all over each other, being either redundant or at cross purposes, that we really want to be connecting and coordinating, saying, hey, we see an opportunity right now in country X. Let's coordinate the kind of efforts that we have. So yeah, we are really excited about the possibility to do that. And we think also, this is one of the big things that the Labor Department does is with our technical assistance, it's sort of the combination of the carrot and the stick. You have the trade enforcement measures, which are what motivates companies and governments to change their wicked ways sometimes. And then you have the technical assistance, which can say, hey, we want to help you. We want to help you build your labor inspector. We want to help you put together a system that really works where you can get out there. We want to help academics and NGOs also do the kind of research that can help us trace, for example, cobalt through the supply chain in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or cotton through the supply chain in Pakistan. So those are some of the technologies and the technical assistance and the work that we are doing that we hope will be very impactful in this space.
Absolutely. So you referenced the sort of incentives that companies have to take action in the space. And David, I want to turn to a question we got from the audience from you, which was particularly about kind of whether consumer-driven approaches are effective, you know, consumers being notoriously fickle about what they say they care about, and then their purchasing practices not always following that pattern. But I would love you to talk a little bit about, one, your views on consumers in particular as a driver of change in the space, but then what are the other drivers? Obviously, government action is incredibly powerful, maybe the most compelling reason if you're facing legal liability, but there's a lot of other societal pushes that are happening, whether that's investors, whether that's employees. What are the other things that you're seeing companies respond to in this space that's starting to change behavior?
Yeah, that's a great question. So thank you to that from the audience. Certainly, consumer-driven, boycotts or other things can work. We've seen them drive change in the past. They're just incredibly difficult to get organized and to sustain. And there's also a real challenge when it comes to consumers having the kinds of information that they might need to make choices when they're faced with several different options in the supermarket or at the department store or on Amazon, wherever you are. It's also just the case that people need to buy T-shirts and other things, and it can be overwhelming when there's really no confidence that this is a typical collective action problem that we see in both the environmental and climate and human rights space, that the feeling that your individual action would be meaningful at all is one that I think a lot of people grapple with. And so if you're not facing a large-scale, massive societal, response to something, then it's very unlikely that you'll be having an effect. That said, there are many actors some of whom you just referenced, including investors. I think this is a critical one. Large-scale. There are, from BlackRock to others who have made commitments, public-facing commitments, to be better about some of their the way that they choose investments and structure their investments that can have a real effect, because they're in control of significant amounts of capital and in control of picking oftentimes winners and losers in certain industries. And if they make, I think they would characterize this as coming from like an ESG perspective, but we're all talking about the same or similar things: ethical company behavior and an interest in the era of unaccountable company action ending. And so investors, especially large-scale institutional investors, state pension funds and others can have a really meaningful impact. And then I think there's also the need for both civil society, but also for journalists in the media to a story in a major newspaper or on TV that can drive people's attention and government attention, drive reputational risk. There's a real opportunity, I think, for especially as we're starting to implementing some of these new tools that we've just discussed, stories that center worker or community voices, stories that demonstrate, like this report does, the challenge of some of these things, but then call attention to the fact that there is either governmental or other path forward to solving this, can really make a meaningful difference in driving company behavior, company choices, and ultimately, as Barbara was saying, we're not going to enforce our way out of people making choices that are best for them as they see them, but certainly the U.S. and Europe and others shouldn't be contributing to a system that allows those choices to remain so limited.
Absolutely. And Barbara, how how do you sort of empower workers in this way, and particularly when you're talking about child workers and their families, how do you center their voices and their interests in that particularly difficult demographic?
Well, empowerment is a very important tool and issue, and we have really great experiences with children. Our people, our project partners, they really go from door to door. They ask children, they talk to children, and they ask them, what do you want? And a lot of children tell us, oh, wow, it's the first time someone asked me what I want. So slowly, we organize children, we talk to children, we educate children, and I put them into schools, into government schools. We train teachers and so on and so on. And once children start raising their voices, and you have to imagine that these are very poor children, these are girls who never are supposed to open their mouths and protest against something. But then they do, and then it's a kind of a wave going on, because families get aware, parents get aware, other children get aware. And slowly, from village to village, development comes, and children go to school, parents decide to send them to school, and so on. So it's work that takes a lot of time, but once we have the children speak out, listen, politicians listen to their voices, then it works. It starts working.
Great. We have a question from the audience. I think it was for Heidi, who's facing some technical difficulties. So I'm going to see if either Thea or David wants to take it. So if the new EU directive imposes legal liability on companies that fail to undertake adequate due diligence, what impact will this have on U.S. companies? And maybe I'll pair that with sort of what steps do you think U.S. companies or any companies should be taking to kind of prepare for a directive like that may be coming? I don't know, Thea, if you want to give that a shot. Yeah.
Sure. I'll just jump in a little bit. I mean, I do think that we are in a new era, and that it will behoove most companies to start taking these steps to be able to have the eyes into their supply chain, whether they are directly impacted right now by the EU directive or whether they might be selling goods into the United States. But certainly for large companies with resources, this is an important investment for them, and it will pay off. And I just think that companies that get out ahead of it are going to be better positioned to succeed in this world than the ones that drag their feet and wait until they are facing, some sort of legal challenges and so on. So, even though the EU directive doesn't apply to all companies, there's a cutoff in terms of size and so on. You could be like one employee down below the cutoff, but it's just smarter, I think, for companies, because here's the thing, that politicians and consumers and all of us are asking them to do more. We're saying we're in an interconnected global economy now. And so your choice with respect to environment or worker conditions or freedom of association or child labor affects all of us. We are, in a single market in that way. And so either it affects us in the sense that, consumers don't want to be complicit. They don't want to buy goods made in horrible conditions. They want to support the environment and changes, and they want to support companies that do that. But it's also true that businesses that are trying to do the right thing and are in competition with the undermining companies feel it's unfair. And so, you're going to have all these, I think there's just more coming down the pike. And so whether, in the particular moment in history you are or not covered by one of these directives, you should imagine that you will be soon.
Great words of advice for companies. And I think that Heidi is now reconnected. And so I'm going to throw it to her, and I'm going to ask you a similar question, which is, the question we got from the audience is what does this draft EU directive mean for U.S. companies? But the broader question I want to ask is what steps you would encourage companies to be taking right now in anticipation of a directive like this coming out, whether they're going to be specifically covered by the directive or not.
Yeah, thank you. Indeed, I somehow pulled myself out of the discussion for quite many minutes. But right, so what is very helpful for European companies, and I hope this will also be important for non-European companies, is that the directive will be applied to non-European and European companies in the scope of its application, which operate in the EU internal market. So that's why there has been quite some considerable interest from the US. And in general, I believe that this could trigger this international coordination that Thea was talking about. Then how should companies prepare? Well, I think they should use this time now for learning and to understanding how to map their most salient risks in the supply chains, whether for human rights or environmental issues or governance issues such as corruption. And there are many companies that already do this because it's their company business model. And I think it's important that companies adapt also their governing bodies to the new realities, because very often companies do not speak sustainability in the real world. And this is a lesson that they have to learn. And they should be sure that there will be enforcement of this directive. It will be both for states on administrative duties to see that companies are complying. And there will be a civil liability element for serious failures in due diligence. And as we have seen already that there are quite many court cases around the world where victims of forced labor or child labor are challenging companies. And I think this is at the moment a kind of I would say, customary law. And I think we have to sort of write it into legislation so that it will become a practice and a right for remedy and access to justice for the victims. I'd like to say that as for child labor, I very much agree with what Barbara has been talking about, that we need this development aspect in this whole, because we cannot expect that just simply a due diligence obligation will bring the children to school from the cocoa plantations. And that's why our group of Responsible Business Conduct Working Group has now written to the EU Commission that they should do a pact with the two main cocoa producing countries in Africa that export to the EU, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, for a pact on living wage and making sure that the cocoa farmers get a fair price indeed to address these root causes that Barbara mentioned.
Thank you so much. We're going to squeeze in one last question, David. I'm going to send it over to you because I know that you've got member organizations around the world. How much do you see this as a US and EU driven approach in terms of these adoption of legal liability and import bans? And do you see progress on this issue happening in other parts of the world?
Yeah, thank you for that. And just very quickly, I mean, in many ways, it's proper that the U.S. and the EU or the EU now, and the U.S. hopefully, Canada, Australia, these kind of countries that are thought of as collectively, although it's a term I don't love, but kind of global North or Western countries. This is where most major multilateral companies are headquartered and do their business. So this is where there's jurisdictional nexus to have pieces of legislation like this. At the same time, the effect of this legislation is probably not going to be most directly felt, except for in the case of liability, in Brussels or in Berlin or in the U.S. Its intended main effect is downstream in supply chains in many countries that have not been, where workers or communities have a harder time having their voice and their views heard and incorporated in this process. And so I think it's incumbent on those of us who are involved in the development of this type of legislation and involved in the have the closest connections to those who are in a position to enforce and adopt, to be bringing those voices into the center of that advocacy and that experience, so that we're being responsive to what communities and people want. But ultimately, obviously, this will need to be a kind of global system of corporate behavior enforcement, and there's really no other way to drive out the types of abuses that we have been discussing. And so while it's appropriate to start here, I think it needs to take hold everywhere.
And I would note in that vein, we're following with a lot of interest the process happening right now in Japan to draft human rights due diligence guidelines for companies and maybe move in the direction of binding legislation as well. So I think you're right that this is something that a lot of economies are picking up. We're going to have to leave it there. This has been a fantastic conversation. Haiti and Thea and Barbara and David and also Sabina and Michael, really appreciate you taking the time. I think there's a lot of work that's underway here that's really exciting. So we'll certainly check in with all of you in the future to see how these developments unfold. But in the meantime, thank you so much for the work that you do and for taking the time to be with us today. And have a great day, everyone.